Well, between school and stuff, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes, you're
but experience. But we're very lucky to have her here with us today to be able to talk about this topic. I forgot what I was going to say, but I want to let you talk some more about your qualifications in this topic and what brings you here today, and I'll let you go ahead and take over.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? I really don't want to use the microphone, so if you can't hear me, just let me know, please, because I don't want to stand here behind a podium and use the microphone. So yeah, like Nina said, I am Beth. I'm supervising the ABA program, which is a newer program to DAB. We are building it. We're working with children with autism, which is my primary focus in my career, as well as like staff training and parent training are some of my biggest interests in trying to disseminate ABA to the world. Yeah, so there's really not much more to say about me except for that. So today, what brings me here today is I was asked to do the training, which I think is pretty cool, and I'm really excited that so many people were interested in one or all of this topic. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, because I've approached this from 3 different topics, and I kind of want to get a gauge for the audience and who is here for what, basically. So the 3 different things that I'm going to talk about today are autism spectrum disorder, behavior, and then functions of behavior, why behavior happens. So how many people were here because of the autism part of the title? Okay, good. That was going to be my smallest section, so I beefed it up yesterday because I got word that there was a lot of people interested in that piece of it. How many people were here because of the behavior or why behavior happens purpose? Kind of the same. Okay, how many people were here for the whole thing, the whole title? Oh, good. Oh, good. I hope I hit all of it as much as you need then. So I do want to talk about that. That's my purpose here, is I'm going to give sort of just a really brief overview of autism. Just what is it? So that you kind of can get a picture in your mind as much as possible. And then talk about behavior, just plain behavior. Inappropriate behavior, appropriate behavior, what it is, what it's not. And then why behavior happens, which in the ABA world we call functions of behavior. So, and I think in the world we talk about all of these things, we just don't talk about it in the way that ABA does. This is not an ABA training. It's going to be approached from a behavioral perspective, which is what ABA does, but I'm not going to teach you about ABA. I'm not going to link it that much to that. It's just going to be from a purely behavioral perspective. What I'm not going to do today is solve individual behavior issues. So just know that up front. I love examples and people posing scenarios, but unfortunately, because I've never seen the people that you would be talking about, I can't solve the problem here and now today. So we're going to talk about some strategies. We're going to talk about some prevention things to kind of help out with those things. So that's usually what people want out of the functions of behavior part of my trainings. But unfortunately, solving behavior issues is not a fairy magical dust thing. So I wish it was. Wouldn't it be an amazing world if it was for people with disabilities and without? So that's sort of a brief intro to what we're going to do. I hope I can work this okay. I already talked about that. So let's talk about autism a little bit first. So what I want to talk about with autism is generally just some really basic statistics, because the statistics of autism are mind-boggling at this point in the world. And then talking just a little bit about autism characteristics, maybe some potential causes. I've got some pretty cool videos to show. And then just basic treatment. I'm not going to get very much into treatment. I'm just going to talk about just a general overview of it. History of autism. This is a really packed slide. I'll let you read that on your own. Autism, what now is known as autism or autism spectrum disorder, as it's been referred to in the recent years, it was documented a long, long, long time ago. It just wasn't called that. The reasons for those, the things that they were seeing, some scientists and researchers were seeing, were attributed to the things that we now know are incorrect. But the point of this slide is just to know that autism, what we now know as autism, was documented a long, long time ago. Prevalence. This is really astounding. Currently, as of 2018, the statistic is that 1 in every 59 births will eventually receive a diagnosis of autism. When I first started doing autism trainings, which Nina so nicely pointed out was a long time ago, it was 1 in 150. I actually think it was 1 in 151 or something like that. So over the course of my career, which I would say I'm not, that old in the field, although maybe I am, that's a huge, huge difference. To go from 1 in 150 to 1 in 110 to 1 in 88 and then 1 in 68. That is, and then now 1 in 59. That's pretty astounding. Boys are four times more likely than girls to be diagnosed with autism. That's also huge. And if you've ever worked substantially in the autism world, you will know that that's true. Referrals that come in almost always are boys. You get one girl every once in a while. So that's a pretty interesting one. Autism affects, there's no difference across races, ethnicities, cultural groups, socioeconomic levels, nothing. The statistic stays the same. Twins are also something that I am very, very perplexed by. Identical twins, you're more likely to have 2 twins if they're identical that have autism, and then obviously they share the exact same DNA. But non-identical twins you still will see twins, one has it, one doesn't, identical or fraternal. So it is, and I have worked with families that have identical twins, one has autism and one doesn't, at least not by a diagnosis, or, I don't know, it's astonishing to me. I don't know how that all plays into it, but I think it's really interesting. New statistics about just the world population is 1% of the world population has a diagnosis of autism. That doesn't seem like a lot at first. In fact, I wasn't going to put it on here, but then I thought about it. It's the world. 1% of the world, not just the US. That's a lot. That's more than 3.5 million Americans. And the prevalence in the US has increased by 119% since 2000. It continues to be the most commonly diagnosed around ages 3 to 4, although I will say that because of awareness and other contributing factors, we are starting to get to see kids much earlier than the age of 3 to 4, which is amazing. Reliability for diagnosis is generally considered around age 2, so diagnoses around age 2 or younger are given with caution. So why the increase? Honestly, I don't think anybody knows. We can guess. My personal opinion, but it's only my opinion, is that diagnosing has become better. Even over the course of my career so far, pediatricians are identifying autism and doing something about developmental delays without hesitation much more frequently. So even being able to refer families earlier to some sort of testing and then possibly treatment if needed has started to occur more often. When I started, you couldn't get pediatricians to refer families. They said, oh, every child is different, every child develops differently, wait a year, we'll see them in a year, and then we'll go from there. You still hear that periodically, and families then have to advocate for themselves. But you're now hearing more and more that pediatricians are referring kids for services faster. Maybe there's a true increase. That would be interesting if somebody could figure out if that's the case or not. And then of course there's some other hypotheses, but we don't know for sure. This is just a cute little thing that I like. so let's talk about what is autism. Is everybody hearing me okay? I feel like I'm yelling. Okay. Autism is a spectrum disorder, and what that really means is that across kids, no kids, no adults will ever look the same who have the same diagnosis. So there is such variability in severity and also in just the characteristics that you see. So there are core common characteristics that we're going to talk about that you must have in different groups in order to qualify for a diagnosis of autism, but what that looks like in those groupings or characteristic groups are so diverse. I've never had kids that have the same exact behaviors as another kid or the same look the exact same, which is part of the complexity with trying to figure out why autism happens. This is a really great quote. Dr. Stephen Shore is actually an adult who does a lot of speaking around the world and the country who has a diagnosis of autism. I was fortunate enough to see him speak, and this is such a true quote. If you know one person with autism, then you know one person with autism. Very interesting. I've been in interviews before where one of the questions is, how many people with autism have you actually worked with? Because if you say one, that doesn't really mean anything. If you say 30, then that means something because you've seen a whole lot more differences amongst that population. So autism. This is a very brief summary definition of what autism would be. It's a group of complex disorders of brain development. So talking just technically about the diagnosis of autism, that definition, in order to qualify for a diagnosis, has changed in the last several years pretty substantially. So I don't know, how many people have heard of Asperger's, known somebody diagnosed with Asperger's, and then, or maybe even PDD-NOS. So in 2013, that all went away. So this is the old DSM-4. That was when there were several diagnoses all under the same umbrella, and they all got a diagnosis individually, individual titles. Autism spectrum, or it was actually autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, PDD-NOS, childhood disintegrative disorder, which also has a physical component to it, so there was physical regression. But there was things that appeared that weren't there when the child was born that mimicked characteristics of autism, so that's why it was lumped underneath that category. And Rett syndrome also has a physical component to it and affects mainly girls, but they now have teased out that Rett syndrome is actually a chromosomal condition, so it's actually been removed from the DSM when the revision happened in 2013. So all of those things now have gone away. So you still might encounter people that have the older diagnoses, but if they were to go through another evaluation and receive a diagnosis, they would no longer have Asperger's. They would have autism spectrum disorder. A couple of the reasons why these changes happen, and we're going to talk more about the changes in just a second, but is there was a lot of inconsistency with diagnosis. You had to fit kids into one of these categories, or if they didn't qualify for the two main ones like autistic disorder or Asperger's disorder, they received PDD-NOS, which was considered the catch-all diagnosis. The problem with PDD-NOS is that it was most of the time ruled out for autism coverage or any kind of insurance coverage for treatment because it wasn't considered autism. So the DSM-5 came out in May of 2013, and that's when the big changes to ASD occurred. So now there are 3 different categories that people who are doing diagnostic testing look at. They look at social communication and then repetitive and restrictive behavior. And then they basically, if the child qualifies for the diagnosis, they actually now label a level of severity. There are 3 different levels of severity. I think it's mild, moderate, and severe. And it's based on the amount of support that they feel the child would receive or need to receive. The other things that the DSM-5 does is that it adds in that the symptoms or the characteristics that they are being seen for must have occurred in the past. So there must be some report or some documentation to show that these things have persisted over time. Some people believe that the changes encourage earlier diagnosis, and maybe that's so. And then the big things still stayed the same where we look at social communication, they look at social interaction, and they look at it across all different. It must interfere in general ability to live at whatever age the child is at. So there must be significant barriers to how they are able to interact with their world, their environment, their natural environment, and the community. So, I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to show a little video. And I apologize, I might ask for some help to see things because I'm looking at it from a strange angle. So this video is a very old video, but I love it because it shows the differences in a very young child who is suspected to have autism and the differences in joint attention, which is the ability to be able to check in with people, to share things with people just by your eye gaze. So you see a plane and you look at the plane and then you look to see if someone saw that plane too. Or when you're playing with something.
At UCLA,
if you are scared, you look to someone, you shift up, you show that you're scared in some way, you share that. So, and that's one of the things that you might see with a child who has a diagnosis of autism or needs a diagnosis of autism, maybe doesn't do. This starts in infants.
Marion Sigmund studies social behavior in small children.
Somewhere around about 8 to 10 months of age, normal infants become very interested in the reactions of other people.
All right.
And by about 13 to 14 months, 15 months maybe, infants begin to look at people a lot when they're enjoying something, as if they want to share this experience. They also look at other people when they're not sure of how to act. So that if something happens that's frightening to them or surprising, they'll look up at another person to see what their reactions are. And this happens to all babies. It's a very common occurrence. And it's so much part of life that we don't even notice really that babies are doing it. But they're really checking to see what we're looking at and how we feel about what we're looking at. So we call this joint attention or shared attention.
Sigmund measured joint attention in the responses of 3 different groups of children to various stimuli. Normal babies, children with Down syndrome, and children with autism.
Very nice.
Children with autism don't pay much attention to the attention patterns of other people. They don't really look at where other people are looking. It doesn't seem to occur to them that other people have points of view that can be shared. And so they seem very isolated in that sense.
In a similar experiment, Sigmund studied the reactions of children to someone else's pain. It takes a normal baby only a few seconds to realize that someone is hurt. Children with Down syndrome respond readily to the emotions of others. But someone else's distress doesn't seem to touch a child with autism. It's as though emotions are a foreign language he can't interpret.